Now let's talk about one interesting position in Caro-Kann. What I was recommending in Caro-Kann, simple system to play and easy to adapt, is exchange variation followed by c3. And there are several ways black can develop. They can go knight f6, they can go e6. Well, let's look at g6. And again, we are not covering the opening itself. We're just covering logical approach to the opening. Well, after g6, we don't know what black wants to do. We go knight f3. Sometimes they want to play bishop h6. Well, if the bishop h6, your plan here is so you can take or you can let your opponent take, castling, and then on knight f6 go rook e1, maybe queen h6, and then knight d2, knight f1, knight g3. Basically play in the center, concentrate on the center and the king side. But that's not what I want to discuss now. After g6, white plays knight f3, bishop g7, castle, knight h6. Okay. Black has very clear plan, rook e1, and after castle, we continue like nothing happened, knight d2, because black may want to play bishop f5, then we can go knight b3 or even knight f1, putting on g3. This is quite position, slightly better for white, nothing serious, but it's easy to play. However, black may choose to go f6. f6 contains the idea that if white is not careful, they may have a very difficult position. For example, knight f1, knight f7, and if they just simply develop, they may get hit by e5 and experience very big problems. There is a rule. As soon as your opponent plays f6, and before they are ready to go e5, and they may be ready to go right now, the first thing immediately what white has to do is to go c4. Now e5 will never work because we're going to take cd, bishop c4, and create serious problems for black. e5 is not good, d5 is coming. Black has very difficult position with artificially placed pieces on f7 and g7. So on the other hand, if black goes e6, we can go knight b3 here, preparing maybe knight c5, and after knight f7, bishop f4, and after g5, well, we can even take on d5, go bishop g3. Symmetrical pawn structure, what you cannot compare activity and placement of the pieces for white and black. Beautiful bishop on d3, terrible bishop on g7, okay bishop on c8, very nice bishop on g3, and plus white rook is better placed. So there is nothing in this position in black's favor. There are several things that I already mentioned. in white's favor. So very frequently when we have strategy, sometimes our strategy says, most of the time, what we want to do. Here our strategy is to go knight f1, knight g3, put the bishop on f4, but here after f6, the situation changed. Black just jeopardized their king position. Black just made pawn weakness on f6, blocking their pieces. But black is preparing very strong activity in the center. Now we're changing the plan. That wasn't part of our strategy, but that's a logical approach. So you logically come to conclusion. My opponent wants to dominate in the center. I have to stop him. And I also want to open center because knight on h6 and bishop on g7 will look very silly. Well, in this position, we wouldn't think about move like c4, but because move like c4 does nothing but creates weakness for us. See, it's a big difference. And one move later, this is very powerful move that guarantees white very solid advantage. Well, the idea is general in these openings, in these types of pawn structures. Let me show you. Well, there is completely different opening and completely different pawn structure for now. But you have to know when white castles, for example, black goes bishop d3, d5, cd, ed, knight e2, and rook e8. Every time, if this happens, suppose black goes bishop g4 to play bishop h5 and bishop g6 on f3, must be played c5. Same thing. You have to do everything to stop white from moving e4. Now, e4 is not going to be very easy to play. Later, black is going to go bishop g6, move f3. But here, it's okay for white. In the example that we saw, that was for black. If black does that, it's, well, I would say that playing f6 in a similar, with a similar type of the idea after knight e2, it may turn out to be very bad idea. This position is already very difficult for black. Black prepares e5, white goes c4. In Nimzo, white prepares e4, black goes c5. This is the common thing. It's like a best antidote to your opponent's active plan. So that's how you dismantle it, and that's how you make your opponent pay for the weaknesses they make. Now I want to show you a few more examples of logical thinking. This should help you. This is not DVD about various different openings. No, it's about way of thinking in the opening, because we are not able to remember every move in every opening, and even if we did, it won't help us, because likely we're gonna face some moves that are out of the openings, and away from the openings your opponent made some move that he thought it's a interesting new idea, or maybe he made the new move because he didn't know what the right and old move is. But always logical thinking and evaluating and assessing what this move does, what it doesn't do, well, whether this makes sense or not, and how can we take advantage of it, and what is the logical response to it. Let me give you a few examples, couple of mine, couple of not mine. Well, but this is one example. C4, E5, knight C3, knight F6, G3, C6. D4, E takes D, queen takes D4, D5. I'm white, my opponent is black, bishop G2, bishop E6, CD, knight takes D5, knight F3. Well, here, if knight takes knight, then we can play queen takes C3, which creates little difficulties for black to develop because of G7 pawn. My opponent played queen B6. He wanted to exchange queens. After castling, he wants to exchange queens in order to develop his F8 bishop. Exchanging queens by taking on D4 is a bad positional mistake. And why? Knight takes D4. It's wrong to assess this position as an endgame position. This is not an endgame position. Only queens are off the board. And when only queens are off the board, most of the time it's not an endgame position. Correct move was knight D7, continue developing. Maybe later knight F6 and try to develop R-square bishop, but after queen takes D4, knight takes D4, knight takes C3, BC. Now I think black is lost. The big problem is B7 pawn. Now when white goes rook B1, what to do with B7 pawn? It's very difficult for black to defend here, and they lost very quickly. This is a bad idea, bad concept. Sometimes when you want to exchange queens and go to endgame, the position you're going to get to may not be the endgame. Bad plan, a lot of weaknesses, and a total disaster for black. Bishop C5, rook B1. B7 pawn is hanging. You cannot go B6 because knight takes C6. And you cannot go bishop B6 because even bishop A3 will be strong. A4 is very good. There is no real defense against A5. So black played bishop takes D4, CD, and B6. But now white has two bishops, very powerful center after E4, and black is almost hopeless. A4, castle, bishop F4, rook D8, rook FD1. And black here played knight D7 and just gave C6 pawn because there are practically no moves. On bishop D7 we're gonna go E4. and things are getting a lot worse. Now let's go back to this. We don't need to see the end of that game. Let's go back to that position. So you got to the bad position. My opponent sees that bishop cannot be developed. But exchanging queens, he didn't have any defensive plan in mind because he didn't realize how bad it's going to be. So what to do here? What's the best defense? We can find very frequently, we can find ourselves in some kind of bind that we have difficulties to complete development. We have to make the best effort to get out of it. Knight d7, as I already mentioned, is the best move. And now black next move, well, suppose white goes rook d1. They have to play maybe knight, this knight or the other knight, probably the d5 knight to f6, trying to play bishop c5, and they have playable position. Terrible plan, queen takes d4, puts them immediately in lost position. That's how logical move. Sometimes they want to play queen takes d4. Now, how can you tell in this position that, well, let me tell you, this is very bad move, and because queen takes g7, it's obvious to see. But you know, this is even worse. And my opponent failed to understand that, and logically, black is completely lost here. It's very good example how sometimes playing quickly, and he said, okay, well, in this position, he says, I have little difficulties in unwinding my pieces. Let me exchange queens. And he went there and practically without thinking exchanged queens. Without thinking, he got position, type of position that you normally get without thinking. And black is totally lost here. Very good and instructive example. But I'm sure my opponent was good enough if he put a little more thought in the position and says, okay, after I exchange queens, how would I finish development? He was never able to finish development without losing a pawn, even after exchanging queens. And this is careless and thoughtless approach to the opening stage of the game.